our final week of how the New Testament was formed. And let's do this. Jackie, would you open in prayer and then we'll go? Is that okay?
Pressure, yeah. Lord, we want to thank you for this fellowship that we have with each other. And just the camaraderie that we feel. It doesn't matter if we're in church or not. We know that we can call upon each other and that we're here for each other. We want to thank you for your unconditional love. We ask you that you fill our hearts with your love and your joy. You help us see others as you see them. And you guide us, our decisions, our actions for your glory. We ask these things in your name, Lord. Amen.
Amen. Okay. I noticed on my board last week I had 2nd century, but we remember I went into the 3rd century with Origen of Alexandria. So let's just start at the top of the notes. Origen is important in the development of the canon because of his many written works with thousands of citations from the accepted biblical texts. While he does quote from works like Barnabas and Shepherd of Hermas, he does so rarely compared to his citations from accepted texts. So we see the movement, which I'm going to summarize at the very end. So now we're going to finish the 3rd century, because there's really only 2 other writers of any kind of help when it comes to the New Testament documents, and then we're going to hit the 4th century. So Dionysius of Alexandria, a bishop, and Cyprian of Carthage, a bishop. So we're talking Egypt and North Africa.
Which one was North Africa? Alexandria?
Alexandria, Egypt, and then Carthage is North Africa. Dionysius, remember Origen, right? We all remember Origen. He wrote like a ton of works, a commentary on every book of the Bible, translated the Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek. I mean, he was a giant of the scholar. He wrote so many works. We don't have a lot of them, but we have enough to know that the guy he spent his whole life writing and serving and teaching. Dionysius was a student of Origen. That's another reason he's important. He's a student of Origen. And then Cyprian wrote a treatise in 251 entitled On the Lapsed. And it was a very, very important document for early Christianity because it describes what to do with believers, how to lead them in penance, and when is it okay to excommunicate a believer for apostasy or adultery or one of the major sins. So it was an incredibly important document, and both of these men write enough that there's not a ton like Origen, but they have a body of work. I think 3 or 4 documents, 3 or 4 works each. But what's interesting is, and that's what we're about to look at, the quotations they make. Remember Origen is the first early Christian writer who clearly quotes from the Epistle of James. Remember, that was one of the documents that we didn't see in the early Christian writings, and that's why Origen's citation from James is important. Well, Dionysius quotes from James. He refers to Hebrews as written by the Apostle Paul, and he discusses Revelation, and he mentions 2nd and 3rd John. Remember, those were the minor epistles, those were the minor writings that had not shown a lot of citations in other Christian writers. In Dionysius, we still have 2 Peter and Jude missing. His comments on Revelation are what's important for us. Look at what he says. Dionysius states that some then of those before us rejected and cast aside the book in every way, speaking of John's revelation. And then he goes on to admit, I should not dare to reject the book, since many of the brethren hold it with zeal. So all through the class I've made comments about certain writings and how they weren't referred to, or there was conflict over them, and that's one particular quote that shows you that there was conflict with the book, with the Revelation of John, although it's only one of many. Revelation had a ton of early Christian writers that didn't like it, didn't accept it, thought it was weird, make comments like no one can understand it, and so it was one of the last ones to come into what we would call accepted books. Well, there you go. In this discussion, he also admits that he does not understand the text. In addition, there's discussion because he doesn't know which John wrote the text, and that's the other problem, is that people were unsure that it was the John that wrote the gospel. But what's interesting is we only have that citation of Dionysius through ecclesiastical history of Eusebius, which we'll get to. And we do not have a large corpus of writing from Cyprian. He quotes biblical texts quite often, and yet there are no citations from James, 2 Peter, Philemon, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, or Hebrews. He does, however, quote Revelation frequently. So you see the tension. You have one father who loves Revelation and another one in the same time period. And listen, if you get to know church history, remember one's in Alexandria, Egypt, and I'm doing the map from you looking at it. This is Alexandria, Egypt, and this is North Africa. They're maybe 150, 200 miles apart, Carthage and Alexandria. And they're diametrically opposed on many counts. Remember I talked about Clement of Alexandria and Tertullian? Tertullian and Clement are so far apart theologically, not on basic theology, but on technical stuff. They're really apart. So I just find that interesting. These links that I've given you are links to good scholarly works that I've found on Google Books. Now look, the problem with Google Books is you don't get to see the whole document. But for me, I'm usually not going to read the whole book. I'm looking for something very specific. And but the reason I'm telling you that these links are good and they're good, I always look at the scholar. I find out where he or she, where they are, if they're on a faculty. And then I want to find out what their references are. I look for good scholars that I recognize in the footnotes and how they're treating the text. And if they meet up to my high standards, then I consider them to be a good scholar. Now, a good scholar may not agree with me. I was also telling Kathy, I like to read scholars who I don't agree with. I like to read liberals. I like to read people that I know don't take the same worldview as I do, because oftentimes they're going to give me data points that people who are more conservative do not give me. And I want to know what the facts are. Give me the data and let me think through the issue rather than, a lot of conservative scholars, I hate saying this on video, but I'm going to anyway. One of the weaknesses in conservative scholarship, and this is one of the things that unfortunately liberals held against conservative scholars still do, is that conservatives have a tendency to not tell you data points that disagree with us, because they think it would damage the witness of the gospel. And that's not the job of a scholar. The job of a scholar is to lay the data in front of people and give your arguments for and against it, but honestly put the data on the table. And unfortunately, I'm just telling you that's, in fact, the best Christian scholars, if I were to give a generalization, tend to be Catholics, honestly. Especially in church history. Okay, sorry about that. That was a I don't know what that was. The New Testament canon in the 4th century, an explosion of Christian literature comes in the 4th century. This is because Christianity has advanced. By the beginning of the 4th century, Christians, we are told by Eusebius and Lactantius, they are everywhere. They're in government, they're in the military, they're in local government, I mean, they're running businesses. Christians are, there's the feeling in the Roman world that these people are taking over the world. You know? And so there are a lot of Christians, they've made a lot of advances, and there are a lot more Christian writers and scholars. You know, papyrus has become far more prevalent, and so it's easier to get your hands on. It's not as expensive, and there's just a lot of education going on. So here we go. Lactantius. Eusebius is this guy. Athanasius of Alexandria. The Cappadocian Fathers, which includes Basil the Great, his brother Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory Nazianzus, John Chrysostom, Jerome, Rufinus, and then eventually Augustine of Hippo. All of these guys illustrate how the New Testament had become far more settled by the 4th century. Now, those are all guys writing after the middle of the 4th century. So most of them are in the 350 to 400 range. But they write voluminous amounts of works, and they quote the biblical text constantly. So we have thousands and thousands of citations. And by the 4th century, in these guys, you hardly ever get quotations from non-accepted documents, unless they're specifically commenting on a non-accepted document. However, the 4th century also begins with the newest and worst persecution of Christians under Emperor Diocletian, to the point that it's called the Great Persecution, to separate it from all the other Roman persecutions, which there are probably 6 or 7 significant persecutions up until this point. I think we talked in our church history class, you know, we sometimes get the idea that the Romans were constantly persecuting the church, and that's not the way it was. There was an ebb and a flow. One governor likes Christians and has more tolerance, and then he dies, and his replacement just has a problem.
So the persecution was localized?
Usually. Usually the persecution is localized. But the great persecution takes on a different nature. It's brutal, and it's more widespread because it's ordered by the emperor, not by a local governor. Usually the local governors are the ones who, you know, who knows why. I mean, every one of them is different. The reasons are different. But the great persecution starts with Diocletian, and you know what? I'm just going to tell the story. I didn't put it in here, but Diocletian is sitting around with a group of, you know, men around him and counselors and soldiers, and he's trying to get a reading from his diviners, you know, the guys who kill a pig or kill an animal and throw the guts out on the table, and then you get men who read their entrails to give the emperor some clue as to what the gods are wanting from him.
I wouldn't want that job.
Yeah. So while the diviners are trying to read the entrails, there's some Christians who are in Diocletian's court, and they're off to the side, and they do the sign of the cross over them to protect them from the demonic spirits. They believe there's demonic spirits when a diviner is doing this kind of stuff. And the diviners, or diviners, however you say it, get frustrated because they can't read the entrails. And the emperor says, what are you doing? What are the gods telling me? And the diviners said, we can't read them, something's wrong, and we think it's these Christians over here. They hexed us with that sign of the cross. And Diocletian has them taken away, they're beaten. I don't know if they're killed or not, but it's the beginning of just
Persecution.
a brutal persecution. And this time it's a little different. In the past, the Romans attacked the bishops or the pastors. They figured if we can take out the bishops and the pastors, the church will fold. Well, what they started realizing is you take one guy out and another, a presbyter or a deacon steps up and takes his place, and they're unafraid. In some places. Now, in some places, they all kind of go into the woodwork and wait for things to calm down, but then they come right back. This persecution is different. Rather than just attacking the leaders, they start burning the churches to the ground. By this time, the churches, especially in a bigger city, will have built buildings. Instead of meeting in homes, they're meeting in small buildings. And there's actually a cathedral in Nicomedia, a fairly large cathedral, and Diocletian and his Caesar, and I don't remember the Caesar. Is it Galerius? It might be Galerius. I apologize. I didn't plan on giving you this off the cuff history. They're up on a balcony in Nicomedia, and he orders the destruction of the cathedral. By the fact that it was called a cathedral, it must have been fairly large. And the soldiers come and try to break the doors down. And a lot of the Christians, to protect their building, have gathered inside, and they boarded up the doors. And the soldiers start throwing torches through the windows, and they set it on fire, kill a bunch of the Christians, rip the doors open, steal all the, by this time they had gold. They had a gold chalice and golden plates for the elements in communion and offering, candelabras. The type things that we think of in a traditional church, and they're all made of gold. And the soldiers start throwing it in bags and run out with it and throw some of the stuff out on the street, and the common people are grabbing it, and it's like a rioting, looting moment. And they're searching for the holy books. They're searching for the scriptures. And this is another reason the great persecution is different. They start looking for biblical texts to burn. And they grab all the documents, they throw them in a big pile and light them on fire. And this begins kind of a moment where the Christians are like, okay, we've always guarded our sacred text, but now we really have to guard it because the Romans are trying to hunt us down and burn our books. And if a Christian leader was arrested and could produce a copy of the scriptures to be destroyed, he would be released. Those who handed over sacred writings were called traitors or tratadores, and they were typically seen as lapsed in their faith and not allowed back in the church. Thus the importance of Cyprian, because that was what he wrote about, is the guidelines for how to deal with this kind of issue. And that was there was a severe persecution in 249 through 251, I believe, is one of the other persecutions that Cyprian was a part of, or involved in, or victimized by. There are a few reports of bishops, I was telling Kathy this today, there are a few reports of bishops tricking Roman officials by handing over medical texts written in Greek, which the Romans accepted because by this time the Romans speak Latin and read Latin, and Greek has kind of become unused. And so they would see these Greek documents, and they would notice figures that they couldn't read, and they accepted these documents, and they would burn them, and then the bishop would walk away. And I was telling Kathy, to me, that's kind of, that's smart to me. That's kind of being
genius.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the other, especially in northern Africa, that alone puts you as a traitor. Doesn't matter if it was a medical document. The fact is, you didn't step up the plate and accept your martyrdom, accept being thrown in prison or having an eyeball gouged out. That was another thing that happened, is there were torturous things that happened. They gouged eyeballs out, cut fingers off, cut people's noses, branded them with irons. It was pretty brutal. Anyway, and that, right, what I just described to you is what led to the Donatist crisis in North Africa. Again, we're in North Africa, which split the church and caused the newly victorious, I'm kind of jumping ahead because it's important for you to, why I even brought this up, is this context of handing over documents, the sacred text in the persecution, leads to what we call the Donatist crisis, which is what Emperor Constantine faced as soon as he becomes emperor. The church in northern Africa is sorely divided. You had Donatus was a leader in the church, and he went around with his buddies, and they would walk into a Christian church and throw out the existing pastor or bishop because they had been accused of handing over documents to the Romans to be burned. And the Donatists took over about, 6 or 8 churches in North Africa, kicked the small C Catholics, because they called them Catholic, but it was not what we call Catholic now. We kicked out the Catholics and took over their buildings. And so Constantine had to get involved in that. He was asked to get involved in it. Okay, but that happens, that happens, before the Council of Nicaea. So maybe that's why I put it there. I'll just read your notes. You actually spent enough time thinking this through. So the Donatist crisis is around 312, 313. I think it's in the early teens. Now you might wonder, well, the Great Persecution started in 303. It lasted for a couple of years, not just a couple of months. It was a fairly long ordeal. And a lot of Christians died, a lot of Christians were imprisoned, and a lot of Christians were tortured. And so, but it took a little while for them to organize enough to even have this conflict in North Africa. Because, we're in the age of, instant news. Well, it takes time for the news to spread that 6 churches were taken over by this, Donatist group. And then it takes longer for that news to reach Rome, and then it takes a little longer for it to reach the emperor. So
So I have a question, and this is kind of getting off track. So
are you gonna try to trick me and get me back to this morning? Is that what this is?
Go girl, go for
yeah,
it.
what are your sources for this? Now, you said something that made me curious, and that is about
Yes, Dr. Hildebrand.
how did the service structure evolve? You made references to the gold implements, and so that makes me think that there was a standardized structure of service and worship. And how did that come about, and was it different between these various churches?
Great question. It is a great question. And what
Cite your work too.
I'm sorry?
Cite your work.
The first thing I'm going to tell you is the Didache. Remember the Didache?
Mm-hmm.
A very early Christian document is actually, and you're going to see, was it last week I referenced? The Teaching of the Apostles?
Yes.
Yeah. It's called by some Christian writers the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. Now, few people think it really came directly from the 12 Apostles, but that's the tradition. And that's what Didache means, teaching. And the Didache is like a handbook. It's a ministerial handbook telling a young man, or typically a young minister, how to conduct the Eucharist, how to do water baptism. Now it's very rudimentary compared to what we now have in many churches, but it's somewhat of a church manual. But as your very good question alluded to, everything's different from region to region. They do differently. So there is no one set standard. What happens is there's a slow evolution, just like the New Testament slowly becomes structured. Church polity and the way they did things slowly develops. Because there's a funny need that we all have, isn't it? For a McDonald's. I want to be able to go to McDonald's and have the same burger in Alabama that I get in Texas. And there's this funny need that humans have that we want it all the same. We want a church in Egypt to be the same as North Africa, to be the same as in Asia Minor. The regions resisted that. You have bishops, we mentioned this, churches in Asia Minor and in the Mediterranean area tended to be more Jewish in orientation. They followed the Jewish calendar. They followed Easter was set at, help me out. Easter was set around Yom Kippur, when the Jews, isn't that right, the Day of Atonement?
Yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah.
But Easter would be set over Passover.
Oh, Passover, the Rosh Hashanah, what we call that. Rosh Hashanah, is that right?
Rosh Hashanah is the New Year. Yeah, those are in the fall.
Okay, well, I can't remember.
Passover. It'd be Passover.
Easter would be around Passover?
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is what's that called, Passover?
Passover.
Oh, that's what they
He's
call it.
looking for another one.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, that's right.
Passover is
What is Yom Kippur again?
It's in the fall.
Well, what is it?
It's the Day of Atonement.
Oh, Day of Atonement. Okay. My apologies.
I don't know why you're not just up on all about Jewish everything.
Well, because it's not in my, that's why I have Kathy. That's not in my arena. So, my point being that the Eastern churches tended to use the Jewish calendar for
Right.
everything.
Okay.
And that was one of the very earliest conflicts that we had, is that, remember when Ignatius of Antioch is being led to Rome to his execution? If I'm correct, I think I'm right. When he gets there, he meets with Roman bishops and he asks about when they're going to have Easter, and they start telling him about Easter, and he's like, or maybe they were saying we're about to celebrate Easter, and he's like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? And then it was like an explosive moment, because we got guys in Rome and guys from Syria, and they suddenly realized we don't do Easter on the same time. You're kidding me. And they were very unhappy. And it caused a sharp conflict. And that conflict never goes away. That's the seedbed of what becomes the East and West divide in Christianity. What we call the Great Schism of 1051, I think. But it's because they have it's a different mindset. It's a different cultural approach to everything. So there is no one way of doing anything. So, anyway. Okay. So what happens is Constantine becomes, all right, we didn't do this in church history class because we didn't get to it. Constantine claims to, when he's marching to Rome, to have his decisive battle against Maxentius, I think. All these names get rolled around in my brain. I think it's Maxentius. He has a vision. He claims that he sees a vision in the sky of the cross. And the words come to him, by this conquer. And now what you need to know, I mentioned earlier in an earlier paragraph, Lactantius. Lactantius is a Christian bishop, becomes a Christian bishop, and he is traveling with Constantine. He is the tutor of Constantine's oldest son. So Constantine already has a Christian influence in his life. Lactantius is one of the witnesses to this event, or he at least writes about it. And Eusebius writes about it later on. So I know that in Protestant circles, I was taught, and most Protestants are taught, that Constantine was not really a Christian. I'm pretty sure he's been sainted in the Catholic Church. I dedicated 2.5 or 3 years study about 5 years ago to Constantine and his whole life. I read 3 major scholarly writings and a bunch of academic articles and journals and blah blah blah. I just felt like it. I wanted to learn about Constantine. And my opinion is he had a genuine conversion experience. I believe he was a Christian. And I have many reasons for that I can't go into now. But for the sake of our discussion, as soon as he takes sole rulership, of the Roman Empire, he begins, actually before he takes sole rulership, he begins to hear about the conflicts that had evolved, the Donatist crisis in northern Africa and what we call the Arian crisis in the Roman area, in the Italian region. And he is beside himself. Oh, I messed up. The Arian crisis in Alexandria. Oh, that's funny. You should edit that out, Steve, when we do the video. Arius, a presbyter in Alexandria. Has anyone noticed how many times Alexandria gets named? Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, Arius in Alexandria, Dionysius of Alexandria, Athanasius, he's one of the major players at the Nicene Council. Alexandria is huge in early Christianity for a bunch of reasons. But an Origen would be one of them, because until Origen, we don't have anybody that writes a commentary on every book of the Bible. I mean, he's the first guy that's doing this. So Arius has applied some of Origen's concepts regarding the transcendent nature of the Father beyond what was accepted as orthodox. And his teaching on the nature and relationship of Jesus with the Father portrays the Son as distinctly different from the Father. And he even states that this is Arius, not Origen. Arius even states that the Son had been created, because he's the only begotten Son. And Arius argues that if he's begotten, then there had to be a time when he did not exist. And you can imagine that causes great conflict, because it goes against, for one thing, it goes against John's gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So that causes a great conflict, and Constantine, in order to try to get these guys on the same page, he calls for the Great Council of Nicaea. The discussion at the council is almost completely theological. At the end of every church council, and Nicaea is not the first church council, it's just the first what we call worldwide council, and even that is a misnomer, because it's mainly Eastern bishops. Very few come from the West. The West is offended that Constantine chooses a location that's further east than they want to travel. They want it to be in Rome, probably. And they're offended at Constantine that he goes off. He goes to his summer chalet and it's a wonderful place, and he hosts them all. He pays for their travel, and he lavishes a lot of gifts on them. It's really an amazing event, but the guys in Rome and North Africa are like, we can't be bothered to travel, even though the emperor is asking us to. It's kind of crazy. At the end of every church council, they would draft what are called canons. Canon means a rule. These are our rules. These are the rules we decided on. So when we call it a New Testament canon, that's why we say that. It's the rule. These are the documents. This is the rule we follow. These are the documents. And so every church council would draft canons. The canons drafted at the end of the Nicene Council deal almost exclusively with administrative issues. And I give you some examples. Canon 4, a bishop should be appointed by all the bishops of that province, and at least 3 bishops should meet to make that decision. Canon 6 gives bishops of Alexandria, Rome, and Antioch authority over bishops in the greater region. Canon 10, no lapsed believer should be ordained. Canon 15, ordained leaders should not move from city to city on their own accord. Almost all the canons are like that. Not a single canon addresses the New Testament. Not a single one. In fact, no church council, until we get to the Synod of Hippo in 393, we don't have a council that even talks about, they talk about the biblical text, but they don't make any rule or listing of documents until we get to 393. The whole point I went over that Nicene Council is a lot of people think that it was at Nicaea that the New Testament is voted on. It doesn't even come up. It's not even a topic. The topic at Nicaea is, what is Jesus? Is he the same substance of the Father or not? And that's at Nicaea that they come up with homoousios. Homoousios, the same substance, or the same being, actually.
Did they just make words up?
No, homoousios is actually a very good word, but it's an existing Greek word that talks about, it's a philosophical concept. But what's interesting is some of the guys at Nicaea didn't like the word because it wasn't in the New Testament. And they didn't like using that to describe Jesus. And funny enough, we're talking about how the New Testament goes together. So that was one of the complaints. It's not in the sacred writings. That word's never used. Why are we using a word to describe Jesus that's not used in the sacred writings? They don't have a New Testament like we have, but they had we've already seen that the last 2 weeks. There's a building acceptance of the documents. So what were you going to say?
Nothing.
Oh, I thought you were going to ask. Okay.
No, just.
And I just wanted
These
to
words are.
comment on Nicaea because of that, okay? All right, Eusebius. And it's important to know Eusebius was at Nicaea, okay? Nicaea was a big event. Eusebius was there. In fact, the Nicene Creed is kind of a baptismal creed and an adaptation of a baptismal creed. I'm almost sure that it was the creed that Eusebius's church in Caesarea used, and it was modified. And I think, I didn't plan to go into all this, but I'm pretty sure Constantine urged Eusebius to come prepared with a creed. And Eusebius took their baptismal creed and kind of retooled it a little bit for the Nicene Council. Eusebius is known as the first church historian, and he's our primary source for the history of the first 300 years. His great work, Ecclesiastical History, or Historia Ecclesiasticus, is 10 books in length and covers the beginning of the church through the defeat of Emperor Licinius by Constantine in 324 AD. Eusebius had access to the tremendous library in Caesarea compiled by Origen. Origen had originally been in Alexandria, Egypt, and this was the reason for Canon 15. Origen was invited by some of the leaders of the church in I can't remember what province Caesarea is in. I can't remember, but it's over in Asia Minor, northern Syria, somewhere, I think, around there. And he's invited to come there because he's a great teacher, a great scholar, and they wanted him to come and teach. And so he just up and leaves Alexandria and goes to Caesarea, and they like him so much, and he's running into problems in Alexandria because some of his writings are, he's a scholar, he's a thinker, and he asks a lot of questions, and a lot of people are nervous. But they don't like him traveling to another region where he's offered a job, and he stays there for 20 years, and he amasses a great library because he's a scholar. And so Eusebius is the beneficiary. Eusebius is around what? I think Origen writes a lot of his documents in the 230s, 240s. Eusebius is born in 260. Eusebius is really writing, starts the major part of his writing in the 330s. So he's 60 years after Origen? And he's the beneficiary of Origen's work, and he has a great library. And he's constantly quoting works in church history that we do not have. And that's one of the important things about Eusebius. He quotes from works, he gives titles and authors. We don't have the documents.
So the library was destroyed?
Well, I don't know.
History to tell you.
No, I don't know. There's probably a history, but I do not know. But we do know that, when you pile a bunch of books that get dried out over time, sitting in a monastic library, fires were not uncommon. A lot of libraries were lost to fire. So, I don't know. I can certainly find out. But anyway, so Eusebius quotes from numerous ancient texts that give us a good look at the beginning of the church. Many of these texts I already said all that. Ecclesiastical History was edited several times, and his final version is completed somewhere around after the Council of Nicaea, because the end of his document is about the Nicene Council. In his text, here's why I said all that. In his text, Ecclesiastical History, he gives lengthy discussions about the accepted texts and why they're the accepted texts. So he's incredibly important for our understanding of the New Testament in the middle of the 4th century. Okay, the 330 era, or the 320s, 330s. And the only problem is he doesn't do it all in one place. So you have to take a snippet here and a snippet there. And what I've done is taken, with the help of Gregory, the Gregory text that I gave you earlier, I'm drawing from his source. And so what we get from Eusebius in his church history is the 4 Gospels. They're not named, but we're told there are 4 Gospels. You remember that's kind of what had happened. The Acts of the Apostles, the Epistles of Paul, the first Epistle of John, and that of Peter, the Revelation of John, and then he says, these are among the acknowledged books. And then he says in another place, of the disputed books, but known then nevertheless to many. In other words, here are some disputed books, and even though they're disputed, a lot of people know about them and use them. Okay? And he lists James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John. Then he says, whether they happen to be of the evangelist or of another of the same name, he's referring to John. And you remember that's what Dionysius said. He accepted John, but he wasn't sure that it was, or Revelation, but I'm not sure if it's the same John that wrote the gospel. And that was one of the problems with John, the letters of John, is that no one knew, okay, which John wrote this, or was it the apostle? There was preference given to an apostle if we know he wrote the document in the early church. And then down a little bit further, among the spurious works. So Eusebius says, in addition to the accepted works, here are some that are spurious. We're not sure about them. They're questionable. The Acts of Paul, the so-called shepherd. Who remembers shepherd? Shepherd of Hermas. The Revelation of Peter. Barnabas. You guys have heard Barnabas referenced numerous times. The so-called teaching of the apostles, which is the Didache. And then he says, and these are in quotations because these are actual quotes from Eusebius. Some have counted the gospel according to the Hebrews. And then another place, those brought forward by the heretics. So he's moved, he has comments about the accepted text. He has comments about, quote, questionable texts. He has quotes about spurious books. And then he has a quote about the heretical writings. And he lists, he says, the Gospels of the heretics. Peter, the Gospel of Peter. The Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Matthias. And then he names Acts, like the book of Acts that we have, the Acts of the Apostles. There was an act of Andrew. There was an act of John. There were 2 different acts of Paul. The Acts of Paul and Thecla is one that has become more popular in recent years by Bart Ehrman. And so he names some of these what he called heretical works. So that gives you a clue of where we are by the year 330. Okay? Ecclesiastical history. Now here's what's interesting, and I separated this over here. In 331, Emperor Constantine is making his plan to move the seat of power from Rome to what he calls Constantinople. He establishes he renames it after himself, and he wants to live there. Now, some people wonder, why does he want to live there? Because in his war against Licinius to defeat, and that was one of the Caesars that he was fighting against to see who would be the principal ruler of the empire, he found himself a geographically perfect place that he had actually seen it in his travels to engage Licinius, and he set his troops up in order to defend himself there, believing that it was such a strategic land position that Licinius, if he attacked him, Licinius is going to lose. It was surrounded by water, so Constantine has his older son Crispus as the naval officer with boats that come in and trap Licinius's navy. And it's just an interesting, the way the city is constructed. It's on a little spit of land surrounded by water. And Constantine thought, this is a perfect place for a capital city. It's easy to defend. And so he makes plans to move from Rome. What do you think the Romans thought of that? They were not happy. And that's another part of the East-West divide, by the way. So, he's preparing to move and establish himself, I think I'm right, in Constantinople. He's in the process. I think I'm right. I'm not a Constantinian scholar, and I didn't plan to give you all these little off-the-cuff comments. That's when I get into trouble. But in 330, this we know, okay?
It helps us to remember. It does me, anyway.
This is what we do know. In 331, Emperor Constantine commissioned Eusebius, because of his great library, and he had a bunch of scribes. Constantine commissions him to create 50 copies of the Bible. And that's the way, 50 copies of the sacred scriptures. Because he wants to gift them to the various churches in the East as just a gift from the emperor. I'm coming there to establish my new city. And, you know, he's gifting them that because, quite frankly, Constantine was very generous.
What language?
Greek.
Okay.
Yeah. Think about it. Because they're going to Eastern churches, they're going to be Greek. The Latin is only in the West. Yeah. But Latin hadn't even happened yet. I mean, the biblical text has not become Latinized because it's Jerome who does that in 380, I think. I think he finishes in 405 or something like that. But we learn of this in Eusebius. After he wrote church history, he wrote the life of Constantine. Look, Lactantius and Eusebius were two bishops who loved Constantine. Both of them served him. They believed, and their testimony is this man was a man of God. And, you know, so the critics who argue that it was all a ruse and it was a political move, you're going to have to overcome the testimony of two bishops who were highly valued in the early church as men of God. And they believed he was a man of God and a genuine Christian. And so he commissions Eusebius to draft these 50 copies. And you can see I put a quote in there from Life of Constantine. Most needful for these Bibles, which are most needful for the instruction of the church, to be written on prepared parchment in a legible manner and in a convenient portable form. In other words, I want the whole Bible in one book. So, you know, as far as we know, it's the first time it had been done. He wants it portable. I want this church to have the whole Bible. He doesn't say Bible. The scriptures in one book. By professional transcribers thoroughly practiced in their art. Because as you guys know, copying the biblical text is extremely important. They got that from the Jewish scribes. The Jews were very particular about copying their text. And the Christians mirrored that. They tried to. There were moments where they failed. But they tried. So, here's what's interesting. That's the only record we have of these 50 Bibles. I mean, they must have been highly valuable. We scholars always thought that they were probably beautifully made, gilded, you know, embossed with color. We have later copies that were like that, and we're thinking that from the emperor, it's got to be like really nice, right? And most scholars agree that whatever books were in this thing that Eusebius put together probably becomes the gold standard because the emperor is the one who commissioned it. But what's crazy is, other than that, the verses in Life of Constantine, there's no record of it, and no one knows where these Bibles went. We don't. No one knows, right? There's a very strange turn of phrase that Constantine uses with Eusebius that scholars debate how to translate it. And most scholars think that the translation is, I want it in 3 or 4 columns. I mean, there's other ways of translating it, but that's what a lot of scholars think he's saying, is that I want a sheet of paper with 3 columns of text. You know, we use Bibles with 2 columns, and it seems like Constantine said 3 or 4 columns. Now, the next paragraph. Many scholars believe that the famous copy that was found, and I don't even know, I didn't look it up, the Codex, what we call the Codex Sinaiticus, is the oldest copy of the Bible that we have. Scholars have dated it to around 360 to 380, and there are some scholars who believe that the Codex Sinaiticus could indeed be one of the 50 Bibles.
Is it gilded as
It is. It's a nice. Now look, the problem with the one copy we have is that a lot of pages are missing from the beginning of the book, and the scholars believe it's Old Testament. You know, it was put together kind of like we have today, Old Testament, New Testament, and the beginning has been deteriorated, and I mean, hopefully nobody tore out the pages like the Nag Hammadi text, but there's just a lot of pages missing. Scholars believe that it must have been around 700 pages. Now the Codex only has 400, and each page has 4 columns of text. And it's in what we call uncials, all capital letters, no spaces between words. You get to the end of a column and you just wrap the word to the next line, even if it's in the middle of the word. Although there is some variance. You know, if you came to the end of a word and there's only one letter, the scribe would go ahead and tack it on there and it wasn't perfect. But, you know, basically they tried to keep it in straight columns. And so a lot of scholars believe that this could be a copy of Constantine's Bible. It has sections of the Old Testament. It has portions of the Apocrypha. It has the entire New Testament, the 27 accepted books. And this is partly why there's these theories that if the Sinaiticus is indeed one of Constantine's Bibles, again, the idea that the emperor commissioned these Bibles, one would think that that became the standard. And it has the 27 books that we call the New Testament. So it's our oldest copy of what we call the New Testament. Unfortunately, some of the Old Testament is missing, but it's Greek Old Testament anyway. But what's interesting is it includes Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas. We can't get away from those 2 documents. Okay.
So are these what are in the Catholic Bible?
The ones that I listed?
No,
Yeah.
Barnabas and Shepherd Hermas.
No, they're not. Barnabas and Shepherd of Hermas, you asked, are they in the Catholic Bible? You're talking about the Apocrypha?
Yeah, I'm talking about your list here.
Some of them are. Do I list in the Apocrypha? Yeah, I list the Apocrypha in a little bit. And the Apocrypha would be in the Catholic Bible. I don't know if 4th Maccabees, the 4th book of Maccabees. You know, the 4th Maccabees is disputed as something. I want to conclude. Oh, jump over here. I want to kind of conclude the timeline on the New Testament. So, there was a very small council. Oh, I didn't write it up here. There was a very small council in Laodicea. Remember Laodicea? You referenced it.
Yeah, I know
last week, didn't you? Wasn't it last week that you referenced? Yeah, I'll spew you out of my mouth.
You know what Laodicea means. Democracy.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
Decisions by the majority.
Okay. Laos is people. Yeah. So anyway, Laodicea in 363, and the 59th canon listed the sacred books that could be read in church. Okay? That's the first church council that says anything about the list of books. All 27 books except the Revelation are in that list. So 26.
Revelation, that's a hard.
Revelation had a hard time. But look, most scholars believe that that document was edited and that last canon was added a couple hundred years later by a scribe who wanted to put a seal of approval on that council. So I felt compelled to tell you that. But it is interesting because that also tells you historically that a scribe wanted those books to be listed. And that's important because that in and of itself is a witness to the New Testament formation. I don't remember what date the scholars think that was added. So, okay.
I believe it was also at this council where they outlawed worship on the Sabbath.
Really?
Outlawed?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know that, but I'll
People
go.
who worshipped on
Hey,
Saturday.
you need to email me to Romney because I want to look that one up.
Okay.
Okay, so the first historical reference listing the exact 27 books that are now in the, quote, Orthodox New Testament is the Easter letter, the Paschal letter of Athanasius in 367. Okay? And he references it like this: but since we have referred to the heretics as dead and to us as having the divine scriptures, lest some few of the simple may be led astray and finally may begin to read the so-called Apocrypha. So he mentions that he's not happy with the Apocrypha. But this is 2 or 3 times where a listing has had a reference to the heretics. So that explains to you why I said, remember the heresies, the Gnostics pushed the church to deal with the canon, because you had Gnostics who were writing documents, and the church felt this need to say, okay, look, there's a demarcation. These books are good, these books are bad. So that's why you get these references to the heretics. Athanasius states that these are the only recognized writings to be read in church. And then he adds that the following texts are not canonized, but are useful to be read. Notice what he says: for those who wish to be informed as to the word of godliness. So what he's saying is, don't read these in church, but these are excellent writings if you want to learn godliness. I mean, come on. That's a seal of approval, but he doesn't want them read in church. But look at them: the wisdom of Solomon, the wisdom of Sirach, Esther, Judith, Tobit, teaching of the apostles, the Didache, and the shepherd, which is the shepherd of Hermas. So what's funny is Athanasius says, and finally, worrying about the simple who might be led astray, that they might end up reading the so-called Apocrypha and any list of works that are in the Apocrypha to be read. Nothing's ever clear. If it was clear, it'd be too easy. The first time a church council ruled on the inspired writings that were allowed to be read in church was the Synod of Hippo in 393. Okay? Unfortunately, so 393, the Synod of Hippo. Unfortunately, there is no document that survives. The only reason we even know about this, and supposedly it listed all 27. And the only reason we know about it is because there is a document that survived the Synod of Carthage in 397, because they referenced the Synod of Hippo. Even this historical reference from Carthage, Canon 24, does not list every single document. In other words, it says the Gospels, four Gospels. Because by this time, everybody knows Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's it. They know this. The only reason for this list is to confirm which writings are sacred and should be read in church. There's no comment on how they came to the agreement, because hopefully this class has shown you it was a slow development. Now, I put a section in about the Apocrypha because it's important. Why is it important? Because the Catholics, the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church, the Orthodox churches, the Armenian church, the Syriac church, the Assyrian church, and the Coptic church all accept the Apocrypha. Basically, the only people that don't accept the Apocrypha are us Protestants. So the Apocrypha is important in the discussion of the New
We
Testament.
wouldn't know much about Alexander the Great were it not for Maccabees 1 and 2.
No, I think Alexander the Great probably appears in other documents. I'm sure he does. But it's just interesting that he does appear in First Maccabees. I mean, no, you know what? We certainly would have heard of him because Josephus gives us a big account of him. Okay. So we're going to just briefly talk about the Apocrypha. This is a set of documents written mostly during the period between the Old Testament writings and the birth of Jesus. The following documents are found in the Anglican Apocrypha. That's the Bible that I use, is the Anglican text. I think it's the New Revised Standard. I just like that translation. And it has the Apocrypha. So these are the works in that. Tobit, Judith, Esther, you can see them. The letter of Jeremiah, Azariah and the three Jews, Susanna, Bel and the dragon. 1, 2, 3, and 4 Maccabees, 1 Esdras, 2 Esdras, the prayer of Manasseh, and Psalms 151. Now look, the works of the Apocrypha differ from church to church. Now, why do I list the Armenian, the Coptic, the Assyrian, and the Syriac church? Anybody know? Anybody want to guess? You might want to guess why I mentioned those 4. They're small. Probably hadn't heard of them. Why would I mention those? Because those are the oldest. Those are the churches that have the oldest record of existence. These churches were probably formed, really, really early.
So the longer time goes on, the smaller the Bible gets? They had more information.
Oh, yeah. There is some truth to that. But these are... The only difference between the Catholics, these 5, and the Orthodox have a very open view about canon. They kind of believe that all these works are good. All these works are godly. All of them are inspired. Barnabas, Shepherd Hermas, Didache. They're not going to, they use them all. And that's, really, all of these groups are kind of like that. They don't have the view that Protestants do. This strict, rigid canon that we have. And but I mention these because they're the oldest. They're the oldest. They're the churches that have the longest record of existence in document form. I don't know much about them, but I'm just telling you that's what I do know.
Do you think the Protestant fathers think that we're all so dumb that we can't read this stuff? And that we didn't need to be knowing it?
No, I'm going to keep reading because I deal with it in slight form and I'll talk about it. So, Jerome includes these documents in the Latin Vulgate. I think he finishes the Vulgate in 405. And he calls the group of documents the Apocrypha. And it was, but the word Apocrypha means hidden. I don't even want to read all that. It appears in some of his comments. Now, here's the last thing. It appears from some of Jerome's comments and the prefaces of a few books that he didn't think the Apocrypha belonged in the Old Testament because it's not the accepted documents handed down in the Septuagint, which the early Christian church accepted that as the Jewish canon. There's a tradition that's disputed about the Council of Jamnia, which was in the 1st century, I think. Is that right?
I don't know.
I can't remember, but the early church accepted the writings in the Septuagint as the Old Testament, and the Apocrypha was never in it. It was part of the Septuagint, but it was separated from the Old Testament, right? It's always been separated. Now, interestingly enough, I haven't talked about this, but there's yet another group of documents called the Apocrypha. Those are writings that happened between the Testaments, but they're not Christian at all. I've focused on the Christian writings, but the epigraphical writings would include Enoch and all kinds of other, some of the Qumran writings out there. They wouldn't be epigraphical. The Assumption of Moses, and I don't know. There's all kinds of crazy documents that were floating around. I don't even know what the names of them all are. So what happened is Jerome has the Apocrypha, and he kind of puts in the preface, these are not, these are good writings, but we're not going to consider them as, on the same level as the Old and New Testament. But what happens is over the centuries, priests keep reading them, and over the centuries, they just become, priests use the writings of the Apocrypha in their theological musings, in their doctrinal thinking, and so before you know it, they're basically part of the Catholic Bible. They slowly evolved into being seen as part of the Bible, just like the Old and New Testament. We get to the well, you can read this. During the Reformation, this was interesting. I learned this doing this research for this. The Wycliffe Bible, which was one of the first Bibles of the Reformation period, included the Apocrypha. The Church of England included the Apocrypha. The original King James Bible. Think about the King James only, guys. The original King James Bible included the Apocrypha. It was the Puritan movement at the end of the 16th century that started to exclude the Apocrypha. The earliest reformers, we call them the magisterial reformers, which would be Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Bucer. I think Bucer's in that group. I can't remember all of them. We call them magisterial because these were the first reformers, and they believed that you should work underneath the government, the magistrates. Now, the next couple generations of reformers took a very radical view that no, we need to be utterly separate from the government. We don't want separation of church and state begins at this point. We don't want to have anything to do with government. In fact, we don't even want government in the church. In other words, we're not going to have a structure. And we ended up calling that the free church. It's known by scholars as the free church. I write about it because of one of the scholars I interviewed a couple years ago from a book that I read of his. And the free church is what a lot of us really are. We are the descendants of the free church. Many of us. The Baptist church initially would be in that. Didn't you have Mennonite or yeah? I mean, that's certainly free church. I grew up in a liturgical church, so I did not grow up in the free church. But the Assemblies of God would be in that. Anything that's independent is in the spirit of the free church. The free church kind of overarching believes that we don't need to be involved in government. We need to extricate ourselves from the world. The Quakers, I'm sorry? Reformed.
Dutch.
Like, which Reformed are you talking about? Like,
Dutch
Dutch
Reform.
Reform's the only one I'm familiar with.
yeah. I mean, you like John Piper Reform, the current Reform?
No.
Oh, okay. Yes. But it's the idea of separating ourselves from government. And it's really in that period, the Puritan movement, that the entire, I believe, fictitious, historical views of Constantine and the Catholic Church started. Because they reject the Catholics, they reject everything about the Catholics, and they say Constantine was a wicked man, it was the fall of the church. Anybody heard that before, that the church was really wonderful until, Constantine, and then have you heard that? The fall of the church?
No, but I've heard that it was, you really had to live out your faith before Constantine, and then when he made himself, like a ruler in in the church and it became easy, and then that's when the money started.
And that is true. I mean, it is true. There were a lot of unintended consequences with his leadership. But, you know, the unintended consequences, I personally think we blackballed him. The Catholic Church didn't exist, in my opinion, yet.
Right.
A lot of Protestants think that it started with Constantine. It didn't. In my opinion, it didn't. Depends on how you define what is the Catholic Church. To me, it's one pope that everybody answers to. And that didn't happen until Gregory the Great. You never had 100% of all the bishops fully behind the Bishop of Rome until Gregory. So, and he was the first. So, okay. So I'm going to read this final little bit because it sums up everything we've looked at for the last 3 weeks. So the New Testament canon developed or evolved over the course of the first 250 to 300 years of Christian history. No particular person made the decision about any of the books. The decision was not made at a church council. The particular writings that became those of the New Testament gradually came into focus and became the most trusted and beneficial of all the early Christian writings. The New Testament was formed by a continued affirmation of the most accepted writings, while the lesser accepted writings slowly faded into the category of good Christian writing. The New Testament came to us through church tradition, starting with the surviving extracts of documents that no longer exist, early traditions about how the Gospels and various letters had been written and who wrote them. As copies of these early documents circulated, early Christian writers first made loose allusions. I want you to see the movement. As these documents become circulated, the first evidence we see are allusions made to what we call the New Testament. Then gradually their citations become more and more clear, and then they become exceedingly clear as accepted, inspired writings, and they quote them pretty much word for word as we see them. By the end of the 2nd century, there are Christian writers with fairly large bodies of work, clearly quoting from these inspired writings hundreds, then thousands of times. From time to time, listings of accepted documents are found. Early lists contain many, but not all, of the documents that end up in the New Testament, in addition to some documents that are not eventually included. Finally, lists appearing in the 4th century contain all the documents that are currently found in the New Testament. The Latin Vulgate translation introduced the Apocrypha, which included documents alluded to by New Testament writers, and that's important. You know, Paul alludes to Maccabees at least twice that I know of. There are just several places where we have allusions to apocryphal works that are in the Apocrypha, mainly Maccabees. But if I'm not mistaken, the letter of James has echoes of the wisdom of Solomon in it. I remember reading something about that, but I'm not a Jamesian scholar, so I'm not going to be held for that. Over time, the Apocrypha became accepted as part of the Christian Bible and was included in several early versions during the Reformation. The later reformers excluded these documents, and eventually most Protestant sects would reject the Apocrypha. To this day, the biblical canon of the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, the Protestant Church, and a few of the more ancient branches differ slightly, with each branch holding to different traditions. I just think it's important for us to realize in our free church that doesn't like tradition, we wouldn't have a New Testament if it wasn't for church tradition.